I mean, Fade to Black is a great song, but
It is.
Yes.
there we go. Hello, welcome to this episode of the Star Wars Generations podcast. Today, as we are joined by returning guest, former host, still all around enthusiast of most things Star Wars, with the occasional exception, Mr. Paul Hoppe. Paul, how are you doing today?
We're doing well. I managed to come through the deluge and be here and relatively dry. So I'm looking forward to talking about one show that I love and one show that I'm interested to hear what happened.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Also, Paul, I need you to be on your best behavior because we have my boss on the line.
I see. I didn't know
We're
this.
also joined by Mr. Pete Wright. Pete is one of the founders of the Next Real family of podcasts, of which this is a member. And so it's just great to have Pete on because Pete is someone who's been talking about Star Wars with me from time to time and also is a big fan of the other show we're talking about, The Wire. Pete, you want to say hello?
Well, hello. I really hope I am not the Prince of Diminishing Returns with that. I appreciate that.
Well, let me start by giving a little bit of a rundown on what we're talking about today, because chances are that, unlike Pete and myself, I'm guessing most of my audience has not seen all of either HBO's The Wire, a gritty TV true level crime story about Baltimore in the early 2000s, or The Acolyte, the most recent Star Wars show. But as I was watching one of them, as I was watching The Acolyte, I kept thinking about The Wire and kept thinking about how the two of them actually seem to have some very similar perspectives about the idea that we often focus on individuals, but really we need to look at institutions and how those institutions affect the people within them. Basically, if The Wire is kind of raising questions of ACAB, is The Acolyte raising questions of AJAB? That's kind of the idea we're thinking about today. Are the Jedi police? How do they compare to police departments? And what is just the degree to which The Wire looks at institutions and how does that apply? Now, Pete and myself have seen both. Paul has only seen The Wire, but we're going to kind of walk him through a little bit what happens on The Acolyte and talk about how all this fits together. So let me start because a lot of us haven't really seen. Let me start though, because I'm imagining a lot of you haven't seen The Wire. Paul, we're not going to give a plot summary of The Wire. It's 5 seasons. Yeah. It's the main character is the city of Baltimore itself. It's a phenomenal show. It's a very depressing show. It's got some of the most amazing characters you're ever going to see on television. But Paul, what do you think about? You and I often talked about sort of the difference between stories of individuals and stories of institutions. What do you think The Wire has to say about that?
I think you can read it different ways if you choose, but the main thing I would say is that The Wire is first and foremost a great show, like a brilliant show. Like when I watched Andor, I was like, is this show as good as The Wire? Because that's basically like, to me, that's the high water mark of television. I think The Wire is great because of its individual characters.
Yes.
And I think everything it has to say about institutions hits so hard because every one of those characters feels like a real person in a real city dealing with what it means to be part of one institution or another, whether it's a legal institution like the police or political institutions or schools or unions, or a not so legal institution like a gang or some hierarchy in the drug trade. And it each season examines how the drug trade affects a different portion of the city, really, right? And they get away with killing off so many characters, so many interesting, relatable, sympathetic characters, and some not so sympathetic characters, perhaps, by just introducing an entire new cast every season to whoever survived the previous season, basically. And at the end of the third season, no big spoilers, but one of my favorite characters got whacked, and I was like, I'm not watching anymore. And then season 4 is maybe my favorite season.
Yeah.
Because they managed to just come with a whole new angle and pile that on top of everything they already had. And really, at the end of the day, most of these characters are entrenched in one institution or another. And I don't view that as a good thing.
Yeah.
I don't think most of these institutions are really doing good things, and I think it doesn't allow the individuals involved to really be individuals in terms of there are these various agencies essentially, and basically what they do is they largely strip people of agency.
Right. Quick interruption. I'm getting some like staticky noise on through my headphones. Are you guys hearing that at all?
I'm only hearing it occasionally when I don't know if there's like something going on with your cable on the microphone, but it's only on certain times when you're talking. I'm not hearing it from I'm sorry, Matthew.
Okay.
I'm not hearing it from you, Paul. But actually, Paul, you have a microphone there, right?
I do, yes.
Get closer to it. Get much closer to it, man. It's a Yeti, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, you need to be. That's perfect. Yeah. You need to be swallowing that thing.
Yep.
Yeah. Much better.
All right, back in that.
I can't remember. Was I saying something or were you saying something? Okay. Go ahead.
I think that's so true. I think one of the things that The Wire really showed me is that when you get these institutions, some of them just have purely, make money, entrepreneurial, do bad things, whatever it is, motivations. But a lot of them, the schools, the unions, even to some extent, the police and the cops, start out from a place of, we have this benign motivation. And quickly, I feel like one of the main parts of the story is that the institution becomes, like, the goals of the institution become not just, we have to do this good thing, but in order to do this good thing, the institution has to be strong, it has to be safe, so we have to protect the institution till it gets to the point where it's the institution itself that you're working on. So that in the seasons about the police, we see a lot of focus on the stats, and the interest isn't in how do you actually reduce crime. The interest is how do you reduce the statistics of crime that are being reported so that the police look better. And with the schools, it's about not how do we give the kids the best education, but how do we produce the best numbers in the testing so that we continue to get funding. And like for the teachers, at least there's some sense of, because if we continue to get funding, we continue to do the good things. But like in all these institutions, I think there's a sense of like, we're so wrapped up in the protection of the institution itself that we're actually losing sight of the mission. Pete, is that kind of what you get out of it?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me to look at this again after so long. It's been so long since I've digested the entire thing. It really is the systems that are on indictment here in these shows, right? It's this. It is it possible? So the show asks, to my eye, to properly serve and maintain the complexity of human institutions that we have allowed to grow potentially beyond the service to us as human beings, as human individuals. And every one of the seasons, I think that largely the last season of the show is I think probably seen as the least favorite. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to speak truth to power here, but I feel like the media season is largely seen as the one that kind of starts lampooning itself. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it is the extent to which the show goes, taking our beloved drunk Jimmy McNulty and making him a purveyor of fake news, right? Like this is the story of embedding the media with a story that does not exist. And to what extent does an officer of the law go to achieve the personal ends of doing good in the world at the expense of the organization that set him up to do it in the first place? It asks the same questions, I think you could say, of Brazil, of the administrative state. Is it possible for the administrative state to truly and authentically serve the goodwill of the humanity that created it? And that Ouroboros that we see in the narrative of The Wire absolutely gets to the challenges of human created organisms. Are they too complex for their own good?
Yeah, and I love the focus on Jimmy McNulty, because let me quickly tell his kind of overall story. He's the person who fundamentally refuses to play the games. He doesn't want to play with the stats. he wants to deal with the real issues. So, for example, when the bodies of 12 people, 12 women who are clearly being trafficked to do sex work are found dead, the various parts of the Baltimore police organizations, whether it's the Marine unit or the city or the county, are all just trying to dump the bodies on someone else in terms of to screw up their stats, whereas McNulty actually wants to solve the crime. And then the situation you described, and basically it is his frustration with the system and his inability to deal with the system in a very kind of, he's clearly coming from the best way, but also has a sense of like, if he doesn't do it, no one else can do it. So to hell with everyone else. He drinks himself into a stupor and blows up his life multiple times.
Right.
And then by that 5th season, there's been massive budget cuts to the police, in part because of some great political machinations by Littlefinger. I'm sorry, in this he's playing a city council member who becomes a mayor and then goes on to even higher office, but is basically the character of Littlefinger without the accent and the focus on Sansa Stark. But the point being that by that 5th season, as you said, we're kind of pointing out how the news refuses to pay attention to the actual crime that's happening. He invents a situation of a serial killer. Right. And so the media gives him so much attention about the serial killer that the mayor starts directing funds towards the serial killer, which he then redirects to be used towards fighting the actual crime that he sees. And of course, it all blows up in his face. And it's, I agree with you that's the weakest season, in part because I think the writers of this show were themselves journalists, so they don't have that level of, they're not separated from it. And I think it was a little too close to home, as well as it being a shortened season.
Yeah.
But it is still, it really helps to drive on this point of no matter who you are, when you're part of one of these institutions, you're almost always going to get eaten alive by it.
Well, they also put a hat on a hat, right? Because not only do we have the story of Jimmy McNulty dealing with his choices to invent the news, but we also have the Stephen Glass character, the reporter who actually invents quotes and stuff. Like he's just a straight up fabulist. And that is that, to your point, I mean, that is David Simon running out of runway to get all the digs into the paper that he worked for during this season. Like this felt like a vendetta season. And I think that's another reason that it kind of feels like it comes off the rails. And yet I still liked it.
Yeah.
Don't come at me, Paul. I mean, I know.
Yeah. I think it's the weakest season, but that doesn't mean it's bad, right? Yeah, I mean, it's still better than the best season of a lot of shows. Yeah. And it's a lot of shows also just how many great seasons can you make, in any given show? I think shows
the answer is 4. And then also this one.
Right.
Sorry, I thought you could say more. Well, so with that established, let's talk about the Acolyte, because Star Wars is obviously a very different world than the one we talk about here. And let me kind of give a little bit of a summary of the Acolyte for Paul. I assume most of the people who listen to Star Wars Generations have seen the Acolyte by now, or not have skipped this because they don't want to get spoiled. But if you're just along for the ride, I would definitely say go watch the Acolyte, because I think, we talked about this at length before, but I'll just reiterate. I think it was a terrible week-by-week show. I think it's a fantastic binge show with some weird timing issues. But the main idea of the story is that I think the Jedi have become it's showing the Jedi as an institution, because in the show, I think the two major there's individuals who have problems, and then there's institutional problem. The individual problem, which I think you see absolutely in The Wire, but also we see all around us, is that when you tell people that their job is to go out and help people, it's very hard for them to see people and decide they don't need help. And we wind up getting this kind of white savior complex story, a Jedi savior complex story, because it's mostly about a character who's not white, but I think you see how it applies, who goes to a planet, who sees these Force-sensitive children being raised and trained in a way that he doesn't understand, and decides they have to be saved. And then interferes in a way that tries to save them without fully understanding what's going on. Terrible things happen because of this attempt to save them. And he starts lying in order to sort of protect himself and protect the people he's trying to save. At which point he involves the rest of his unit, basically, if you think of this like a police squad, a Jedi squad that's on this mission, who then decide that for the good of the Jedi, they have to lie about what happened, because we're getting to the situation where the Senate, the Galactic Senate, is starting to provide oversight into the Jedi, or wanting to provide oversight to the Jedi. And everyone's very concerned that if they do that, they're not really going to understand the Jedi, and they're going to make it harder for the Jedi to do their mission. And so therefore, they have to lie. They have to cover all this up, maintain the lightsaber wall of silence, if you want to go that direction, in order to, as they see it, like to protect their ability to do good in the world. Pete, as someone who saw both, is that a connection that kind of makes sense to you?
Yeah, the sort of cultural implications of the narrative are really interesting. As I started thinking about this conversation, it feels almost this initial investigation into the mothers and the children on this planet. It feels like the police going into the towers in The Wire, right? It feels like we're authority, and that authority has been conferred on us by us, and we're going to come into this culture that we obviously don't understand, and we're going to exert our authority upon you. And the fact that conflict comes out of that is one of the really interesting gifts of this of the season. Even more so, like the show is set up under the pretense that the Jedi Order and the Galactic Republic have been prospering for centuries without incident. But the fact that this happens at such an isolated incident with 4 Jedi on a remote planet indicates that, you know what, it probably happens even more so. And that, I think, is a huge gift to Star Wars lore. The fact that we are building sort of a precedent of mistrust makes it vastly more interesting to know that these people are for lack of a better word, human, right? It humanizes the Jedi, whatever species they are. It humanizes them in a way that we can relate to, because they are all flawed. They're all flawed at some level. And this is the conflict between institutions when flawed individuals are forced to exert authority on behalf of complex institutions. And that's The Wire. That's the whole thing.
I just want to add that we're all wearing blue.
Yeah.
Clearly, we know our saber colors.
So you two are in better shape. I am not a thin blue line by any means. Yeah, so Paul,
I don't know. I'm ranting on this. Does this rant resonate with either of you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see The Acolyte, but I feel like I probably would enjoy hearing about it more than watching, maybe at the moment. I won't get into that too much, but sometimes like I start watching a show and I'm just like, I'm not going to enjoy this right now. And I feel like there's some chance that I will later. And so I'm kind of like, okay, maybe I'll watch it later when I might enjoy it more. But the Jedi, I think, have always, like in the original trilogy, it's just this sort of mysterious backstory, right? And it feels like it should have been like hundreds of years ago that they existed, but somehow it's like 19 or 20 or something like that, which that's, it is what it is. But in the prequel trilogy, we see that there's kind of all this stuff going on in terms of it as an institution that doesn't feel great. I think the Clone Wars does a better job of or at least a job of expounding on that and making it really clear. Some of the stuff with Ahsoka, especially in terms of that, the Jedi are this institution that is fabled and powerful, but also mistrusted by many of the the people on the ground, kind of, or the people literally underground on Coruscant. And or maybe it's not ground because there's no rock, it's like metal, they're under metal, I don't know what it is. But it's and so I think that's definitely a more interesting story, and seeing that 100 years before everything fell apart, there already was some mistrust to begin with. And
perhaps for good reason. I mean, it seems for good reason. Like, we knew that the Jedi were just like taking children from everywhere across the galaxy.
Right.
And I think you had to like give it a little thought to then realize, oh, that's probably not good. Like,
I mean, I know they have matching robes,
right.
but
it's probably not great.
And one thing that this show really focuses on is that the character the character who sort of leads this charge, who is the most, like, I think you made a great comparison there about the cops going into the towers. For me, though, the scene it really illustrated was sort of when the social welfare system of childcare tries to deal with Bodhi. Tries to deal with one of the middle schoolers who like has gotten kicked out of his foster home. And you can tell that there's a sense of like they honestly want to do what's right for this kid, but they just have no idea what that is. Like they put him in a situation where he gets beaten up for being a snitch because they just don't get it.
Yeah.
And a lot of that to me always harkened back to, I think we want to see the people who like break up families, whether it's like, today in the like foster care system with like black families and families of color, whatever, all the way back to 18th, 19th century, social workers taking kids from Native families and others and of all non-white backgrounds and some white, but especially Native families, putting them in white homes, thinking they're like, oh, this is going to make them better because, these strange families with their strange rituals. That's exactly the energy I get from Sun. And yet it is so clear that he has so much love for Osha, the person who he in his mind is rescuing. And what really came to me, though, and this is where it relates to what Paul was saying just now, he tries to say that he can understand what it's like for Osha to have lost her family at age 8 because he lost his parents. Like he has no memory of his family.
Right.
And I think that it really put me in mind of the Obi-Wan Anakin thing where both Sun and that's the right name, right?
It's Soul.
Soul.
I love what you're doing with it, but the name is Master Soul.
Right. It's so I'm thinking
it's a synonym, actually.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
You're in orbit, let's say.
Right.
The person who we find out is the Sith user. His name is a reference to Moon, which is also kind of amazing. But yeah, that Soul, what he's trying to do with his inability to understand Osha's pain at losing her family, to me relates a lot to Obi-Wan's inability, because Obi-Wan was also like doesn't have memory of his birth family and can't really relate to Anakin's missing his mother and stuff like that.
There's an issue. I mean, how am I allowed to say some things about the Acolyte? Are we really steering away from spoilers, or did we just say like
no, we're full on spoilers here.
Okay. This is one of the things that I think is really interesting when you look at a parallel, like really the dark side in itself. And I think that's what they're setting up here in the Acolyte by looking so far in the past of the Jedi sort of, arc, is that the dark side itself is evidence that things are not going great in the High Republic, and they aren't really great for Force wielders in general, and we have to put a foot down on it. But what's interesting about our Sith Force wielder is that sure, he's doing some bad things, but the argument of why he's doing some bad things is not because I want to take over the universe. It's I want to be free and be trusted to wield my power the way I want to wield it. And the first thing that someone does with that kind of a viewpoint when told you can't do the thing you just said you want to do is do the wrong thing. Like it's react with some sort of authority, with some sort of exhibition of power. And that's exactly what we get in season 5 of The Wire, right? We finally get to this point of, look, we know we have built a system of rules together. We humans have built the police force and we built the laws and everything. And we built a system that's supposed to take care of you people. And now we're telling you we can't. We can't take care of you. We can't give you the tools you need to do your job. And you're not allowed to do the things that are going to get your job done. That's the same story as Chimir's story in Acolyte, and leading to sort of why he's an outcast, as our friend in The Wire starting to plant dead bodies. Like that's him trying to figure out I can't do this thing that I want to do in a human system that we built, and now you're telling me I can't do my job. That I think is a fascinating parallel.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think it's one of the things I liked most about the Acolyte, particularly given where so much of the rest of Star Wars comes from, is that whereas the Sith that we've seen, in terms of like, the Emperor especially, but other characters who we've seen, they're fascists. They want to rule. They're authoritarians.
Right.
Darth Biceps, as many of us on the internet have been calling the person who notably doesn't say he's a Sith. He says that's what you would call me.
Yeah.
He's basically like the most extreme libertarian you've ever met.
Exactly right.
He wants to be left alone. And as he basically says in that great speech, if you guys know that I exist, you'll hunt me the rest of my life. So I have to kill every single one of you to make sure that you don't know I exist. So it's a very kind of like, it's get off my lawn with like atomic, to defend lawn. And it makes a very different change because I don't think he even has the sort of like altruistic motives of a Jimmy McNulty, but he does seem to like generally, like when he meets both with May and with Osha, he genuinely sympathizes that like the Jedi treated you badly the way they treated me badly, and I want you to be able to have the same level of freedom with your force powers that I do.
Right. He presents. That's one of the most interesting thing is he presents when he's not, actively killing people. He presents from a position of kindness.
Right.
And that's the sensitive moments that we have with him and the young women are fascinating to me because he actually makes a case. That's one of the things that this show does is make the case for the Sith. And that's a treat. It's a treat to be tested like that. Mm-hmm. The same way we're tested in The Wire in saying, what would I do in this level? If I were Prez in the school system, what would I do if I were faced with this very real constraint in the classroom? How would I choose to solve my immediate classroom problems? Would I do some things that maybe are not necessarily okay?
I'm trying to figure out where to start. It's like I was going to say something about McNulty, but then like Prez has such a strong story, right? Yeah. Where I think I have to. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me give you a 30-second summary. Prez starts out as a police officer.
Yeah,
he's a complete fuck up. He's not very good at being a police officer. He's there in part because his father-in-law is very well placed in the police. But it turns out he's very good with numbers. So when they stop having him be like on the streets and let him be like the numbers guy, he's good at cracking codes. He helps figure out like the beeper codes that the criminals are using. Like he's a really good, like behind the scenes, like, the tech
analyst
guy.
Yeah,
exactly. He gets put back out onto the street during a hard situation and winds up shooting someone else who happens to be a black cop. And the police kind of both recognize that he's really screwed up, but again, they're both like, we have to like avenge our own, but we have to protect our own. So he's not brought up on charges, but he's kicked out of the police and he finds himself as a teacher in a school, starts out incredibly idealistically, realizes how bad that is, and eventually becomes fairly like an effective teacher and a good teacher in part because he is much more hard-nosed and much more willing to like play around the rules and deal with the kids how they have to be dealt with.
Yeah, basically trying to figure out how he can do what he understands the mission to be within the institution that seems to have largely or completely lost sight of what its purported mission is. Right. And I think that's kind of true with him as a cop as well. And I think him as a cop is a perfect parallel to the Jedi because it's basically like, they're basically saying, okay, you're a cop, so you're supposed to have a gun and go out and do cop things. And you can do this other kind of detective work, but because you're a cop, you have a gun and a badge and you go do cop things. And he's terrible at doing gun and badge cop things, but he's actually great at doing I'm in the office detective work, right? Research, trying to crack codes, stuff like that. And it's like the system, the institution didn't have room to recognize sort of the talents of one of its members and to say, okay, this guy shouldn't get his gun back. He should never be on the street as a cop with a gun, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you know, and I think a lot of us are maybe like, well, maybe there shouldn't really be cops on the street with guns, but that's a separate thing,
Also
right?
true.
But here it's like, if you're going to have cops on the street with guns, he shouldn't be one of them. But that doesn't mean he can't do something else that's vital to the mission. But the system has gotten such an idea of like, oh, well, Jedi have lightsabers. So here's your lightsaber, go do Jedi things. Whereas
Right.
like, you know, and I mean, I know some of them are like librarians in the, you know, in the temple and whatever, but like that inability to kind of recognize what an individual's temperament is, what an individual's strengths are, and finding a role for that person that matches their strengths, where you can get value out of them while they are also like basically expressing who they are with their work. They're like doing what they're good at and what they find interesting. And you're like, no, but you have to go do this other thing that then they happen to be terrible at, and, you know, ends catastrophically.
Right. And that's actually kind of a perfect thing, because I hadn't even thought of this, but Soul, the character we talk about, who I think has in many ways, I think by the end of the show, he has fallen to the dark side. And a part of what the show is really about is that that's not a, like, again, there's not like a thin line or a thick line. It's a very gradual thing. And it happened like, because Saul never becomes a fascist or a libertarian. He's always coming from the very altruistic place, but he's coming from that by the end, he's willing to, like, you know, kill innocent people or kill at least people who are defenseless in order to do what he thinks is needed. And we see him at various points, though, being a phenomenal teacher of young people, of younglings. And we see him being incredibly compassionate and able to help Jedi who are kind of losing their way a bit. And yeah, as I think about it, if they just kept him in the Jedi Temple teaching, instead of giving him a lightsaber, instead of giving him this hero complex and sending him out into the world to encounter people like by the way, it's kind of awesome, because they're not Dathomiri, but they're witches. It's another group of witches that is raising these twin girls, and he sees them like in this kind of ceremony that's about honoring their dark side, their force powers. And they're not Sith. They're not like super evil, but they're definitely willing to play with some of the dark sides of the Force that the Jedi find anathema, and that's what kind of sends him into a panic. And yeah, I think he's very much a Prez in that regard of, if they just let him be a teacher, maybe things would have worked out a lot better.
Yeah, we're not like, you know, I raised my kids not to be afraid of words, right? There was no moratorium on, you know, profanity in the house. And as a result, my kids learned a lot of words, probably younger than they needed to. And they have a healthy respect for language. It's kind of the same thing that we see on this planet. We're going to teach the kids the powers that they have inside of them. We're going to teach them to use the things. They are only imbued with good and evil once you do something with them, right? And you can't learn what to do with them unless you know what they are. And that runs headlong into the institution of the Jedi at this period in history. And you can see, Matthew, what's her name in charge of the Jedi with the blue?
Venara.
You can see her wrestling every sequence with what comes next. Should I go out into the field? Should I come back and wear a bigger robe? Like, what? She's constantly wrestling with what she is going to do next to maintain the gentle tension between infrastructure and the agents in the field, the Jedi in the field. And that is a hard line to walk for her.
Venestra. Sorry, I got that name wrong. But yeah. And I think she very much, to me, is the Cedric Daniels figure. Cedric Daniels is, he's the kind of the leader of the main police unit that we follow. And he is willing to break the rules sometimes, but also has a healthy respect for like what the mission is, but also fundamentally believes in the goodness of the cops and the idea that you have to protect the cops first so that the cops can do the mission, without being willing to see the fundamental rot that is there. So that when Przebylewski, the one we're talking about before he even has the shooting, we talked about how a couple of the cops go into the towers, this area they don't understand, and they try to like exert their authority, and it goes nowhere. And there's this teenage kid who's giving them a whole bunch of lip. and Pryzbylewski hits him with the butt of his gun, and the guy winds up losing an eye.
Mhm.
And Cedric Daniels, he is clearly very angry at them, both because they screwed up, but also because I think he feels genuine sympathy for this kid. And I think he, as a black cop, has a lot of frustration with white cops who there's a lot of racism in how they treated this. But the first thing he says to Pryzbylewski is, get your story straight. Like, he still has that, we have to protect the institution, and you're part of the institution, even though I think you're a fucking idiot.
Yeah.
And that's Venestra is the one who doesn't go on the missions, but winds up kind of here. I'm going to shift actual movies for a second. If you think about the ending of The Departed, I'm going to spoil the end. It's a fantastic movie. Skip ahead if you haven't seen it yet, but it is like 20 years old, so I feel okay seeing it. You know, part of both that and actually even LA Confidential, in both institutes, like at the end, the actual story of what happened is ridiculous and complicated and fucked up. So some of the people wind up like lying to sort of say, oh, it was all this one person's fault, in order to have a story that keeps everything okay. Actually, LA Confidential is probably the better comparison of what happens in The Acolyte.
Yeah. Because
that's exactly what Venestra does. Venestra figures out what happened. She knows that it was Saul who screwed up, but that a whole bunch of other Jedi took part in it. And instead, she kind of just blames it all on Saul, so that it like when she gives her speech to a few of the senators and actually the Chancellor of the Republic about how this was all Saul. And as she's saying it, what I was hearing was, you know, like we're used to with cops that they'll defend their own, but sometimes there's someone like a Derek Chauvin. He was the person who was involved in the killing of the main person involved in the killing of George Floyd, the cops will just be like, oh no, okay, we're going to cut that person loose because they were a bad cop. We're not like that. And when Venestra says this is a rogue Jedi, a Jedi who like isn't like us, I very much heard the cops saying, Derek Chauvin, that's not the institution, that's the bad apple, and he's not us.
Right. It was that was a way to excise the poison and save her role as part of the infrastructure.
Right.
And I think sort of the same happens to McNulty, right? At the end of The Wire.
Yeah.
That he's kind of the bad apple that everybody forgets when they're using that metaphor, that like it spoils the whole bunch, I think is the rest about the whole one bad apple. So saying, oh, that was just one bad apple, we're good. It's like,
say the other apples.
Right. Exactly. Right. They're like, we're not spoiled. We're good.
Nope, we got about in time.
Don't turn us into cider.
And just to add even more context to it, I think The Acolyte works completely on its own as its own show. Frankly, I've heard from a lot of people who aren't Star Wars fans who just see it as a really interesting, like sci-fi, show about all these kind of complicated issues we're talking about. But if you've read the High Republic books, I think it adds even more context, because this is all taking place at the end of the High Republic period. The High Republic books are happening over a long time. Much earlier in this, about 60 to 80 years before the events of the Acolyte, because Venestra is from a species, I think it's named, I'm not sure what it is though. She's entirely green, as you pointed out. And her species has a much longer lifespan. She's part of a series of events in the High Republic where basically, because of failings of the Senate and of human government and of the government of non-force force users, the whole Republic comes close to being destroyed and taken over by these horrible forces. And it's the Jedi who have to save them. And it really is a sort of like I can very much understand that Venestra could go through that and come to the belief that no one will ever understand the Jedi. Everyone will always doubt us, but we are the only ones who can save us. That real kind of chip on her shoulder of it has to be us. And if they don't trust us, well, that's not our fault. We just have to do it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to me. I did not know that about her and her lifespan, and that she comes from this era that actually it fills in a hole for me that I think I've always believed. My headcanon was that, we need to go all the way back to when the Jedi were just like 6 people who realized they can move stuff with their minds and kind of convince each other to order pizza when they didn't want to or something like that. Like when they were a gang, you know, and they were like, hey, we could use our gangly powers for good, or we could use them for evil, and they start recruiting. That's what I kind of want to see. Like, who was the first Jedi? Jedi Dave.
Yeah.
And let's go back to the beginning. Here we already have an impressive infrastructure that is so effortlessly tested and already so inoculated by that whole vibe of we have to protect our own. We are not above. We are the High Republic, and yet we are not above protecting our own at the cost of one, right? It's still gross.
Right.
You know?
Well, and I do think that that's where I made the joke about ACAB versus AJAB. I do think that here's where the metaphor breaks down somewhat, because, you know, for anyone who really knows the history, with policing in this country, there's always been the idea that they're there to serve and protect and all that. And I do think a lot of individual police officers do have that motivation in their hearts, at least at the start. And maybe some actually get through it to the end and hold on to that idea too. I think, though, a lot less. But it did start out as an organization to catch runaway slaves. Like, there's always been some massive problems baked into the institution. I think it's entirely possible that Jedi started from a much more altruistic place, like a lot of unions did, though a lot of unions started out very corrupt.
Right.
You know, and same with school systems, same with any of it.
Reference The Wire season 2.
Yeah, exactly. The Wire season, and what I think the Jedi don't have at this point, but I'm sure they eventually wind up having, and Plo Koon, I think, is a good example of this, is the cop. Well, Plo Koon is the most extreme example, but the cops in The Wire do have people who are no longer at all interested in their overall mission. They're interested in protecting their own position or rising up in the ranks, you know, or in one situation, getting someone who they think has dishonored them because they get a stained glass window in a church. Like, really, an entire season is driven by one man's ego because the dock workers union gets a stained glass window in one church instead of the policeman's union. It's that petty. And I kind of feel like we don't have that with the Jedi yet, but we could totally see it going in that direction.
But we also have the same question that we're asking of the Jedi and the police. Like, is it okay to give somebody a job and ask them to be a savior of all that is good and a protector of those in need? That is also a capitalist unit of measure, right? Like, they're not superheroes, and neither are Jedi, right? That's the thing that I think this show endeavors to pull apart, is these people are not superheroes. They make mistakes, and when they do, how does the what are the antibodies, systemic antibodies that take care of that? The police are they are fallible and wonderful, and the show pulls apart the frustration that exists for individuals of good intent to try to exist in an organization and discover that it's impossible to exist with sustainable good intent because of what we've done.
Yeah, like, I would argue that McNulty isn't necessarily motivated by altruism. Like, he's got a thing he wants to do, which is like, you know, like, he likes solving crimes. Like, he wants to solve murders. That's what he wants to do. And, like, maybe that's why he became a cop. And being a cop gave him a way to do that. Or maybe, who knows why. But, like, each person really does have their...
Yeah.
The people who did become cops in The Wire chose to, one way or another, right? Whether it was, to protect and serve, or whether it was like, oh, that has a pretty good pension after I put in my 20 or 30 years or whatever.
Yeah. Or
right?
my dad and his dad before him were all cops, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The Jedi, I think, are different in that they are superheroes, I would argue. Like, literally, like, they have superpowers within this world. But it's like everybody with a superpower being, this is kind of a little like Marvel Civil War kind of stuff, but like basically being told by the government or by some organization, which is a kind of a non-governmental body, however the Jedi work compared to, the rest of the Republic, basically, oh, you have to sign up with us family and then do this thing that is more like policing. Fair enough.
Right.
Or you have to never use your powers, and then like they become supervillains, right? And so like there's no agency in becoming a Jedi, right? One is basically one's born with their Force sensitivity, and then they're essentially turned into a Jedi by the institution. And that seems extra problematic, compared to like, couldn't there just be some people who have Force powers and they just like use them to build things faster? Is that not an absurd thing? Like, yeah.
And there's actually a great scene in The Acolyte where, and what I like is the show is very rarely saying, we as a narrator can tell you, here's the way the Force really works. It's a lot of different people giving their perspective, and they're all unreliable narrators. But at one point, when the dark side user, I'm not positive he's a Sith, and that's a whole other conversation for another time. But he's talking with Osha, the person who was trying to be a Jedi, who Saul rescued, but now is thinking about joining him. And he talks about how he left the Jedi, and she says, "Well, but don't you lose your powers if you don't train them with the Jedi?" And he says, "That's what the Jedi want you to think." That specifically that he's kind of pointing out, like, yeah, the Jedi claimed, and here's tying it in. Remember Luke Skywalker saying the Jedi claimed they had a monopoly on the Force. And that's exactly what he's kind of saying is actually you can be a Force user if you leave the Jedi, but no one ever does because they convince you that's not true. And do we actually know that it is possible for everyone, or that he's kind of special? We don't, but at least raises the question in a way I love.
Well, it's funny going down this road because it's relative to the universe that these properties exist. Force powers are the authority that are given to these people and for their organization. And what authority is given to the police, right? That given the protection of the laws of the land, weapons, they get guns, they have
the monopoly on legal violence. Is often used.
They have them. Great. That's a great way to put it. If you take away the word legal, then what we have is a much more capitalist clash between the guys who also have authority in their culture, right? They've created their own, the drug culture, and we get a great view of that. And we get a great view of how these guys do their work. And it's full of violence, but it's also full of a lot of payroll. And, and their power is in their guns and who has the bigger guns. And so, to what extent do these are we left to question the value in exerting authority over others by way of these artificial tools is, I think, a principal question for The Wire in particular.
Yeah, Paul, what's kind of your take on the way it looks in institutions in terms of the way it looks at like the gangs led by people like Stringer Bell and then Marlo Stanfield and others like that?
Yeah, I mean, those are institutions too, right? They're just not institutions on paper in the same way. But,
they almost become that, but then Stringer stops him from taking minutes of a criminal.
Right. Yes, that's true.
Do you ever think like Stringer's like, man, I wish we could take minutes? Like,
yes.
God, he's taking business classes. So he has this meeting of drug dealers run according to Robert's Rules of Order.
Yeah.
And this guy wants to take minutes. And he's like, no, that's not it.
Wait till we go fully legit. And then you can take minutes. But like, D'Angelo, he's running a tower or something, right? And then he messes up, and by which I mean he murders someone and gets seen doing it. And then, they fix the situation. So he gets off. He doesn't go to jail for that. But or does he? No, right? He doesn't go to prison. He doesn't get convicted, but he's
not let out on bail. So he's in jail for like 9 months.
Yeah.
He's found not guilty.
Awaiting trial. Right. And then he gets demoted. He gets demoted because he did a bad job of protecting the institution. Yeah. Because he did public violence in a way that brought the heat, basically, right? It's like they don't really care if you shoot someone and it does it and somebody's just dead. They care that now the police care, right? And they particularly care. The more the police care, the more they care. And you know, and they also have like there's the end of season 1 when Weebay basically takes the rap for just every murder. He's like, oh yeah, I did that one too. I did that one. No, that one was Little Man, but he's dead. You know, like, and he's protecting the institution, and they're basically selling him out as like one bad apple almost. I mean, not literally, because authorities view their institution as a legitimate institution, but they're basically saying, no, he's responsible for all the bad things you're gonna, you know, give us a hassle about. But that's actually you know, he's getting a nice severance package kind of thing, because like he's getting life anyway. But and so he gets someone to, you know, be able to feed his fish and everything, right? But that, you know, that's, even when kind of being sold out by the institution, he's still protecting the institution, because there's still like value for him to be gained, you know, to get there. The same way, you know, the cops somebody might be fired, but they still might end up with a pension, right? They still might get some kind of severance. Maybe sometimes they don't, obviously, in rare cases. But yeah, it just.
Well, and one thing I think that I'm really struck by with those two stories of Weebay and D'Angelo is that in both cases, participation in these criminal organizations is baked into their families.
Right.
Like D'Angelo gets caught and doing a mission for Barksdale, and he's ready to turn over to the police, in part because he kind of hates what he's been having to do, and he like seeing just the damage that the work he's doing is causing, and the people getting killed. He's ready to get out, and it's his own mother who goes to him and convinces him to take the heat, to take the years, and eventually he winds up being killed in prison. And the mother is like, no, you have to do this. In part because she's used to this very comfortable lifestyle that she knows will be taken away.
Yeah.
In Weebay's case, his own son is still living with Weebay's Weebay's actually current partner, I think wife, or at least, you know, his girl around the way is the phrase that's used all the time. And the mother is saying to the son, like, you got to go out and bang on those corners. We need to have a better family lifestyle. And Weebay actually helps to break it, because he winds up like working with this great some other people to like help Weebay get out of that kind of a situation. But overall, yeah, it's a very similar kind of thing. And like one thing that I think, to me, one of my favorite connections between the two is that, you know, you've got Cedric Daniels and others having to work with Przybylewski, who they eventually find a use for, but at first it's like, he's the boss's whatever, we got to deal with him. And then you've got people like Proposition Joe who have to deal with this idiot guy because it's his cousin's, you know, I think it's his wife's cousin or something like that. Or, you know, it's his, like, there are a couple people in the criminal organization who have these same family connections. And there are a couple of moments where the cops and the criminals are dealing with each other and realizing they're having the exact same frustrations in their various institutions. And sometimes the moments are very poignant. Sometimes they're hilariously funny. But they really kind of show like the same institutional thing happens in both places.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean it's a Godfather story too, right? Like it's the same thing, like family, crime family and police family. I like the LA Confidential reference. Like all of these are, we're all in it together. We all have the same problems. The Untouchables, right? There's another great story of you know, crime has made us a family and an organization and an institution, and quote unquote legitimate institutions are just going to have to find their way to navigate that, just as we have to navigate them.
Right.
I love that I put myself in the we position of organized crime. I may regret that.
I thought I'm not supposed to tell you about the kickbacks I have to pay with
right.
So D'Angelo is basically like a young kid who's like forced to be a Jedi, and it doesn't work out very well, because like he wasn't really meant to be a Jedi. It like doesn't really I mean, you know, Jedi and
yeah.
I've never made that connection, but you're right. Like all the kids who we see who are growing up in this world where as they understand it, you know, hitting the corners and then rising up in the criminal organizations is their only option.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very much like the younglings becoming Padawans.
He's really, in speaking directly to the Acolyte, he is May and Osha, right? They both, for different reasons, were disregarded by the Jedi establishment.
Right.
One flushed out, one never got it, and got alt training. But
I'm trying to remember the name of Weebei's kid. It's Namor, I think, or Namon, something like that.
oh, that's good. It's not Namor.
It's not Namor.
I think it's Namon. Namond.
Yeah.
Namond. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah, he's a very kind of similar character.
I want to just like comment on how hilarious it is that there's a Star Wars character named OSHA, given their complete lack of workplace safety.
That comment was made on a number of occasions.
So good.
And literally the first time she shows up, she's in a very unsafe work situation, right?
Yes. Yeah, oh yeah, that's right.
So,
you saw the first few minutes of the show.
I did. Yeah.
That's so good.
That is wonderful. Well, we've got a little while on this. Are any of the last comments for Pete, for you? Is any of the last things you want to bring up as part of like this discussion about how putting these two shows in conversation for each other, what they bring up?
Well, it's I guess it's an interesting, putting it in the parlance of The Wire. The Acolyte is an interesting, I don't know, what would the commercial say? An unflinching look at urban life in the High Republic, and I think they've done something really unique with that show, to ground the Star Wars universe in a much more modern human reality that makes it more approachable, more relatable than some of the other properties, just by giving us some of these elements of that we learn about through our exploration of The Wire and these sort of crime families. I think it's really fascinating, and illustrating the struggle between individuals and institutions is table stakes, for these kinds of properties.
Like one of the things I think that really highlighted for me, I have often talked about my frustration that Obi-Wan isn't willing to deliver the killing blow to take out Anakin once and for all. And he's now, with a new Obi-Wan show, has had 2 opportunities to do this and didn't do it either time.
Mm-hmm.
And the way this show, I don't think we'd ever heard it named before in such a specific way, that it is a Jedi tenet that you do not kill an unarmed, someone who is unarmed.
Yeah.
That you just don't do that. And hearing that explained and seeing Soul wrestle with that, I think also gives me a better, I still think Obi-Wan's wrong, but at least now I better understand he's kind of the one good cop in the broken institution. Again, they're nowhere near as broken as there are a lot of good cops in the Jedi. There's a lot of good cops in the Jedi. And and there are some decent people who are cops, but also I made the joke. I don't think AJAB applies the way ACAB does, but I definitely think that like this show helped me to much better understand Obi-Wan in those moments, even if I disagree with him.
It's interesting. I'm sorry, Paul. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that if he's been given a hard and fast rule, like it's harder to do something that violates a hard and fast rule that you've been taught since childhood.
Yeah. It makes you kind of wish the Star Wars had Arkham. Like Arkham doesn't hold people for long, but at least Batman doesn't knock the Joker down, prevent his plan, and then just walk away.
Right.
Like he makes some effort
Right.
to put Joker in a situation where it's like you're not going to screw anything else up.
Yeah.
Whereas twice
at least this week.
Yeah, exactly.
I think this is really, just as we wrap up, really interesting. That the sort of institutional influence in The Wire, the institutions are, particularly in the later seasons, season 2, the unions, schools, educational boards, the media, self-serving, resistant to change, betraying the individual. The Acolyte institutions are flawed and fallible. Like the Jedi Order is totally susceptible to institutional rigidity, right, and moral failure. The David Simon is like on the record as saying, I'm going all in on talking about the moral compromise that individuals have to make in complex institutions, and these are harsh realities, and that's going to be it. It's going to be a noted cynical approach to the argument of whether large-scale institutional reform is even possible. And I'm curious your take on the idea of cynicism in the Acolyte. Like at the end of the Acolyte, do you get the sense that Leslie Headland is presenting a cynical view of the world of the Acolyte? Or because for me, as soon as the show pivots to be more explorational of the dark side, there's kind of less cynicism in the show. I'm curious your take on that.
I don't think it is anywhere near as cynical as The Wire. But I think it's saying that the starting place of Star Wars, of there is clear good and evil in the universe, and there's a light side and a dark side, and there's good guys and bad guys. And yes, it is possible for a good guy to become a bad guy if they give into negative emotions. But as long as they don't do that, they're going to stay a good guy. That world is far, that there can be far more nuance in the world. And I think that nuance can often be seen as cynicism. And I actually push back a little bit in that I think that I think The Wire isn't cynical necessarily. It's very realistic. But I think it is constantly trying to say that there is hope, that there are good people trying to do their best in these institutions. But that, yeah, unless we look at the institutions themselves, nothing's ever going to change. But yeah, there is a hell of a lot of cynicism in that. I think, though, with the Acolyte, it's not, I don't think it's anywhere close to that. I think it's just more the idea of you have to look at these things as much more complex. That there can be, forgive me, this is probably the most direct spoiler I'm going to give, but I think it's a vital point to it. The show, one of the climactic scenes of the show is Osha force choking a helpless, weaponless soul to death. And we're kind of rooting her on when it happens. And we know that it's her turning to the dark side. We literally see, like, in one of the most beautiful shots I've ever seen, we see, like, right down the barrel of her lightsaber and see the crystal turn red and then see her blade turn red because it's been corrupted by this act she's done. And it's not like, oh yes, in a perfect world, I want you to do that. But that kind of like anti-hero, I don't believe in the death penalty, but when I watch someone brutally kill a terrible, terrible person on screen, I'm kind of going to root for it. Even though
I can see how they get there. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. That's kind of how I felt when this person who had her life destroyed by this man who thought he was helping, but was basically an 18th century social worker, I was kind of rooting for her. And then I had to ask myself, what the fuck is wrong with me? I just rooted for someone to use the force choke.
Yeah.
As she turned, but I think that's what makes the show so good, is it really makes us challenge ourselves in terms of this, like, is good and evil this clear and simple?
And possible that I see less cynicism in that natural turn because it felt like a natural turn, and the end of The Wire does not offer me that much hope. Right? Everything falls apart and we are back to status quo. I think the name of the show, The Wire, I think they actually get usable evidence from a wire like once in season 3. I think there's a big celebration. Like, The Wire generally fails. Everybody's always listening to each other. So like even the entire conceit of 5 years of this show is met with cynicism in their inaptitude on all parties.
That's fair. Paul?
It's a lot. Yeah, I only sort of see the Wire as that cynical. I mean, I feel like I generally consider myself a cynical optimist, by which I mean I think everything's super messed up. It's very likely to remain so, but it doesn't have to, right? Like, there are possibilities. And I don't think hope and cynicism are necessarily antithetical, you know? Like, I think you can kind of survey what's going on and not think it's great, but not necessarily despair, right? And I think a lot of the characters in The Wire, no, I think a small number of the characters in The Wire kind of have that viewpoint, and a larger number have the kind of, you know, I've given up and I'm just now fulfilling my purpose within my institution in order mostly just to maintain my own status quo, right? There's just a few characters who have legitimate ambition, you know, Littlefinger, or Mayor Carcetti or whatever from LA, right?
Tommy Carcetti.
Yeah. I think his name is supposed to be like the LA. Anyway, but it's definitely like a lot of people are just kind of going along. They're just like, I feel like it's about inertia almost as much as anything, you know? And I mean, with Baltimore, it's about, there's inertia and then there's decay, you know, because the city has, it used to be a big shipping port. It's not anymore, right? Things have changed, but the city hasn't necessarily changed along with them in a way that benefits its residents. There's an LA Confidential quote that I think kind of perfectly captures this sort of like resignation and sort of just going along kind of inertia. And it comes from Jack Vincennes, the Kevin Spacey character, when Edmund Exley asks him, that's the Guy Pearce character, he asks him, you know, why did you become a cop? And he just says, I don't remember.
Yeah.
And it's just, it just hits, because it's like, here's a guy who's all, you know, he's this like fancy cop who's like a consultant on a TV show. And he finally kind of gets this, like, I'm going to try and solve this one case, mostly so that he gets kind of reinstated in his previous, you know, so he gets to run a tower again instead of just, you know, being in the pit. But it's just like he's lost sight of whatever it was that motivated him in the first place, right? Which is the opposite of Edmund Exley, who's, you know, he's got Rollo Tomasi. He's got this backstory that's super clear. He knows exactly why he became a cop, quote unquote, what he thinks is right. And he would never shoot an unarmed person in the back just because he knew they were guilty and they would get away with it. And, you know, spoilers, maybe he does.
Yeah.
So it actually sounds like a fairly, and maybe we root for him to do so, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. And then, Paul, was there any other last things you wanted to add in terms of this conversation, or kind of where it takes your thoughts? I will say, as bonus content, we're going to ask Paul if this has made the Acolyte sound like something he does or doesn't want to see. I have a guess on it, but we're going to do all that in the bonus content, which, by the way, you can get if you become a member. It's for only $5 a month or $55 a year. You get access to the bonus content that's at the end of all of our episodes. You get access to bonus member episodes. We just did one on the book Darth Plagueis, which is actually quite relevant to this TV show. And most importantly, though, I think you just help to keep the lights on. We are trying not to go the cynical fundraising routes of some of the police and unions and other things like that in The Wire. We just want to get it from our fans and other kind of support like that. So just $5 a month. It helps us we're currently upgrading all of our audio equipment. It helps to keep Pete off my back, begging me to, you know, do more of these things. It just helps us to literally keep the lights on. And it's a great way to show your support. We also love your feedback. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. Does this connection make any sense to you? Are we completely off our rockers and should go back to just talking about Star Wars? Let us know what you think. All the ways to contact us are in the show notes, as is how to become a member for, again, only $5 a year. With that, Paul, though, any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, if we get enough members, can we get like a stained glass window for?
Yeah,
the stained glass podcast window? Absolutely.
Yeah. Nice.
Let's do it right now. Us and the totally awesome 80s podcast are going to have a rivalry over which one of us gets to put the stained glass window on the True Story FM Next Real Podcast website.
100%.
I love it.
I'm down.
Yeah, my last thought is basically just that I think a show like The Wire works so well because while it has these huge overarching ideas that it really wants to communicate and explore, it does that through characters who feel like real people and just instantly they just feel like a person in just a moment. And the one Star Wars thing that really did reach that level for me was Andor, where every character just they're on screen for a few minutes and they just feel like a person somehow. And it's what I would call seemingly effortless writing, which I know is not actually so effortless, you know? Yeah. And so I think when a show is trying to say really big things, I think the most effective way to communicate those big things is to really get the small things right and to really have the people feel like people. And when they do, then those other things can come through in a way that doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like the purpose of this character is to do this thing. And I think too many screenplays tend to treat their characters the way the institutions in The Wire and perhaps The Acolyte treat their members.
Yeah, I think
There,
that's a
tied it all
fantastic
up.
point. I've always said that one of my favorite characters, if not my favorite character on The Wire, is one whose name, the actor's name, is never in the credits because he's never a main character. It's Prop Joe, who's
Oh.
this kind of like side character of a different dealer, but who just has such a, he's so like all. I think one thing that makes The Wire so great is never dealing with stereotypes because it introduces you to 30 different cops and 30
Yeah.
different drug dealers and 30 different teachers and 30 different journalists, all of whom have their own different individual take on things and their own idiosyncrasies and own quirks. And I think that is one of the strengths of The Wire as well is, I think it's one of the strengths of the Acolyte as well, is that we get 5 Jedi who are involved in what happens, each of whom, with one very notable exception, they still haven't figured out how to make a Wookiee in live action be an interesting character other than Chewbacca. But the other 4 each has a very different motivation for how they become part of this plot. And I fully believe each of them, and each of them feels to me like a fully realized character.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, thank you all so much. As I said, members stick around if you want to become a member. Because these discussions will be particularly fun. It's only $5 a month. All information is in the show notes. But for everyone else, thank you all so much for listening. Please share this with your friends. Please send us feedback. We have spoken. All right, welcome back. Paul, as someone who, as I would put it, I think you and I are very different in that we both have a very, like I often describe myself as a cynical optimist as well, but you've often talked about how sometimes you don't want to see that cynicism on screen. And I know that that's something that's frustrated you sometimes with, like, I think you said at one point that you were very surprised you liked Andor so much because it was so different than what you normally like about Star Wars. My guess is that, and there might be a Heisenberg uncertainty principle because the fact that I think this may make you think that you don't want to think it just so I'm not right. But my guess,
You guys, this gamesmanship is too much. I gotta get popcorn. I'm the Frank Zabutka in this relationship. This is amazing.
this has been going on for 25 years, quite literally.
God.
So. But anyway, my math is wrong, but math, that's the whole point. My guess is that you think this is a very interesting discussion and that you like more discussions about the problem of institutions and the problem of policing, but that you don't really want that in Star Wars, that you like the Jedi being good guys.
Right. Kind of, yeah. So that's more or less where I am in terms of, you know, when I was a kid, I saw the original Star
More
Wars
or less,
trilogy.
Matthew.
Like, it's complicated. It's gonna be complicated.
I've learned to take the victories I can get. Okay?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it depends on the day to some extent, right? Like, as I said earlier, I feel like this is a show that I might like on one day and not so much on another. You know, like some days I don't want to watch The Wire every day, you know, like, but I would say that, you know, when I was a kid, I watched the original trilogy and I loved it. And then in high school, I started watching it more. I didn't really love the first Star Wars, actually, like A New Hope. You know, I mean, it does what it does in a great way, but it feels a little sort of flat. These are the villains. These are the good guys. Very straightforward. Not really any nuance there, right? And it is Empire Strikes Back that was my favorite for a long time, partially because there is that, you know, join me and together we will, you know, we'll change everything. And it's like Vader gives Luke a sales pitch on why, like, you know, we'll come to the dark side. It's not so bad. We'll overthrow the Emperor. It'll be cool, like father and son thing, you know, family business.
The Emperor's the bad apple.
Exactly. The Emperor's the bad tree, and Vader is the good apple, who then has another good. Okay, I'm losing this metaphor.
There's definitely a hybridization going on. Okay,
absolutely. We've grafted some different.
Vader is a GMO.
Literally, yeah. So I feel like there's a lot of nuance in Empire Strikes Back, right? It's like, you know, Yoda is giving one sales pitch. Here's, you know, the thing about the light side, the dark side. You got to be like really clear. And then Vader's like, no. Come to the dark side. we'll do some good stuff together. We'll, order and stuff. Who doesn't want order, right? And then Return of the Jedi actually is kind of like, maybe Luke can like force choke it, an orc here and there, right? A space orc. I forget what they're called. Gamorrean, right? And like maybe he's wearing the black and like looks cool, and like now he's got a green lightsaber and everything's a little different. And at the end, it's like, oh, will he turn to the dark side? Won't he turn to the dark side? And and then instead of that, then you get Vader turning back, and there is this like good and evil, but also this idea that like a person isn't just one or the other, and that's it. Right. So I do feel like there's a certain amount of nuance there. In a lot of the stuff since then, sometimes there's more nuance than others, right? Sometimes it's just about like kind of going from good to bad and kind of what that's like. And then sometimes there's characters with that, where we're kind of exploring what's in between that. And, like Andor's different because it's not about the Jedi. It's like I don't love it because it's Star Wars. Like I love it because it's great. And I was not super like excited for it until I found out Tony Gilroy was the showrunner. I was like, oh, tell me more. And and I kind of expected I might like it a lot when I started watching it. And I was like, oh, this is actually great. But I do feel like the kind of digging deep into the institution of the Jedi, like I don't love these institutions. Like The Wire, I love in spite of the fact that it's about these institutions. I don't like institutions.
Yeah.
Like I've barely ever worked for an institution. Actually, I have a peculiar sartorial choice today of wearing the one institution I worked for. This is Grayton Resort and Casino in California, which I worked for about 18 months. Half the time as a supervisor. So I was like doing the kind of like, checking the timesheets and this and that. And you have to like write people up. It's a disaster. Yeah. It's horrible, like, but also, it serves a function. And it's like, you're like, well, I'm trying to do this thing. And so spending a lot of time within these institutions and seeing their dysfunction is not something that I like deeply enjoy, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not so much about the individual struggle between light and dark and trying to make good choices. It's this like being stuck within the institution as opposed to like going out and just doing things. So I don't know how much I would like it or not like it and how much I want to see it. That was kind of your question, your setup originally, right?
Yeah.
And as we were going on, I was like, oh, this is more interesting. Like, I'm really enjoying the conversation. And then you got to the end and you're like, and this is what happens at the end. And I'm like, hey, I don't know. maybe I don't want to watch this. I don't know.
I gotta relate. I totally relate to that entire sentiment. Paul, because there is something about the way we see the poison in institutions in The Wire, and then what I kind of low-key want to have happen with the Jedi. I want to watch the High Republic fall apart from the inside. I want to have it fall apart without a Sith intervention. I want to have it fall apart because of administration. People can't work together, and it's infighting, and that's real. And whether they have lightsabers or not, right? They still, like, politics will be their undoing. And one of the greatest sequences in the prequels is, when we have Anakin go crazy and start killing everybody and his march on the Jedi Temple. Like, it's just very dramatically presented, and it's all okay. Big music and shadows and jackbooted thugs and all of that. And yet it's still an outside force on an institution that needs to be tested a little bit more heartily from the inside.
Right.
So,
yeah,
I'm right with it. And yet I still like the Acolyte. How's that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely always been a bit of a difference between you and I, Paul, because I think for me it's that, and maybe this is, I have a strong need for validation, outside validation than you do. But like for me, I have often felt a lot like a Cassandra, in that like I see all of this brokenness in the world, that so many of the people around me don't see. And so when I hear people talk about like, oh yeah, Derek Chauvin was bad, but the police, they're fundamentally fine. Or, like, yeah, like there's some bad politicians, but like, these things are fundamentally fine. Or, capitalism has its problems, but it's fundamentally fine. It just makes me want to tear my hair out. And like, I have a whole bunch of thoughts about like mental illness and awareness of these kind of things, and they often go very hand in hand. And so for me, I watch something like The Wire, or I watch something like this, and I'm like, oh my God, someone else gets it. Someone else said the thing that I want other people to see. And I think in some ways, that's a lot of why I started the show, is because I wanted superhero ethics, especially, but also this one, is I wanted to know that like other people saw the things I was seeing. In part because to me, that leads to good things, and I'll admit, we try not to talk too much about our direct politics on this show, but I think you're not going to be incredibly surprised to realize that I'm pretty far on the left and know where my vote's coming. And I admit maybe part of where I'm coming from today is the most hopeful I have felt about American politics probably since Bernie was a major candidate. Partially
Since
because
March
Harris.
3rd, 2020.
Well, but in part because of the Tim Walz. I mean, the Tim Walz nomination to me really feels like finally closing the door on the Clinton era of like, we have to run to the middle. But, because he's very much about like, I can put progressive values into terms that Midwesterners and moderates will understand. And so, yeah, maybe I'm going to be a lot more hopeful, a lot less hopeful tomorrow, or God forbid, in someday in November. But I think it's because to me, I think there is something about The Wire is very, it has the sense of hopelessness, but it also has the sense of people are still trying. And I kind of feel like The Wire isn't saying, here's the way to fix institutions. It's more saying, even in all the problems of this institution, these idiots are still bashing their head against the wall time and time again. And maybe if other people see that, then things will change. It's kind of trying to shine a light on that, because this idea that there could be some hope. And I think that's kind of where I come. And so that's why, to me, A New Hope is my favorite movie. I love watching Luke Skywalker have his hero's journey, but I'm never going to relate to Luke Skywalker. I'm always going to relate to Han Solo. And so to me, when we bring that nuance in, that's what I love.
I thought Johnny was the hero of Karate Kid.
Well, we'll definitely get you on to talk about Cobra Kai sometime then.
Right.
I thought Miyagi was the hero of Karate Kid, but
Oh God! And now, okay, that's the part of cynical storytelling that I hate, is that you can't be allowed to have heroes, because I do think that part of what in the Acolyte makes it so good is that Saul is heroic. He's a wonderful, beautiful man who has such love and such compassion, and it takes him into bad places, but you still don't walk away being like, that guy's a schmuck. Like, you're like, it's a tragedy rather than like a villain turn he takes.
Right.
That sounds lovely, and I think I don't want to see it.
That's fair. That's fair. Not for everybody.
But that's the thing.
Yeah, I think there's room for like a season 2 to lure you into a season 1. Like there is some real potential for a season 2 to be straight up compelling to exactly the vibe that you're looking for, the Andor vibe. There's also room for a complete deflation of context, which would be sad, but we'll be here.
We'll see. I also will say, I think starting in episode 4 forward, somewhat in the first 3 episodes, but especially in episode 4 forward, it is some of the best writing and acting that I've ever seen. And I think the 3 acting performances of Amanda Steinberg, Mandy Jacinto, and Jae-Jung Lee, which I'm probably horribly mispronouncing, I apologize, I would put up against any acting performance I've ever seen in Star Wars, and I hope get serious Emmy nominations. So
it's also science fiction Star Wars. It won't, but it could.
Andor got some nominations,
it
right?
Earned it. Yeah, I guess that's right. Manny Jacinto is a real like performative hero in this thing. He like, if you were anywhere closer to the fence, I would say watch it just for him, because he was such an extraordinary surprise with what he did in the show. And the fact that Amanda Sternberg is playing, some twins, is always a treat to watch how somebody does that. It's
the fight choreography alone. It is I'm not trying to sell you. I'm just saying I'm selling the audience more than anyone else here. It's the first time I've seen Jedi as martial artists,
Mm.
and they use like
Yeah.
Hong Kong wire work to help make
Yeah,
that
yeah.
happen in ways that are really fun to watch. So anyway, we've said a lot. Thank you all so much. On behalf of myself, Paul, Pete, you guys are fantastic. Thank you for being members. If you come at the king, you best not miss.